Drenched, I taunted my stepdad Finn in our Austin shower. His grip locked my wrist. Steam turned electric. I'm 19, he's 55, ex-coach, mom's gone. I splashed, he pulled, sparks burned wild. 2 weeks raced hot, too hot. One slip flipped it, what broke us cold? You'll choke. The Miami night was a sticky embrace, the kind that makes you feel alive and reckless, as I, Emma, 19, stood on our high-rise balcony, leaning against the railing, a cigarette burning between my fingers, the city's neon poles throbbing below. It was past 2 a.m., and Mom was out cold inside, drained from her late office shift. Her last call a weary bet I'd keep the noise down before her work trip kicked off, way off the mark. My stepdad, Ron, a 57-year-old ex-astronomer who'd swapped star charts for eco-consulting, had this quiet intensity, his eyes catching mine with a warmth that wasn't just parental, and it stirred a restless thrill I hadn't named. I'd felt it at dinner, his gaze lingering, and tonight, I was wired. The balcony door slid open, and Ron stepped out, hauling his old telescope, its tripod scraping the tiles, his faded flannel open over a plain tee, gray hair glinting under the moonlight. He set it up, muttering about a rare clear sky. Bet I'd never seen Cassiopeia this sharp. I smirked, flicked ash over the edge of flirty, saying he'd read the cosmos like a pro, bet he'd show me something wild. He glanced up, his hand brushing the scope's knob, smirking, saying wild wasn't my speed, bet I'd squint and miss it. I stubbed out the cigarette, sauntered closer, my shorts and tank top shifting, teasing that squinting was my spark, bet he'd shine it anyway. I leaned in, my hair brushing his shoulder, pretending to peer through the eyepiece, flirty, saying he looked hot charting, bet he'd mapped crazier skies. His hand slid to my lower back, light but steady, guiding me to the lens, saying I'd see better, bet I'd fall for it. My stomach flipped, heat spiking, and I bumped his hip, flirty, saying falling was my rush, bet he'd catch me starstruck. He smirked, his fingers lingering, warm through my tank, muttering catching was my dodge, bet I'd reel him off orbit. I grinned, pressed closer, my knee brushing his, teasing that reeling was my thrill, bet he'd tug it tight. I shifted, trying to balance on the wobbly patio chair, flirty, saying he'd better teach me, bet I'd outshine the stars. He smirked, adjusted the scope, his arm grazing mine, teasing that outshining was my trap, bet I'd crash the sky. I laughed, leaned harder, and the chair tipped, sending me tumbling backward with a yelp. Ron lunged, his arms wrapping around my waist, pulling me upright, his chest brushing my back, muttering I was a hazard, bet I'd wreck his scope. My pulse raced, his grip warm, and I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying wrecking was my vibe, bet he'd save it anyway. He steadied me, his hand brushing my arm, teasing that saving was my snare, bet I'd drag him down. I spun, my shoulder grazing his chest, flirty, saying dragging was my win, bet he'd chase it sharp. The city glowed below, stars crisp, and I stayed close, teasing he looked too good under moonlight, bet he'd spark a nebula. He smirked, packed the scope, his fingers brushing my wrist, muttering sparking was my chaos, bet I'd burn this night. I bumped his knee, flirty, saying burning was my rush, bet he'd fan it anyway. He leaned in, his arm brushing mine, teasing that fanning was my hustle, bet I'd blaze him out. I grinned, grabbed my lighter, twirling it, flirty, saying blazing was my thrill, bet he'd glow with me. The balcony hummed, the air electric, and I stepped back, saying he was too steady, bet he'd flare if I dared. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the railing, muttering flaring was my trap, bet I'd hook him deep. I grinned, flicked the lighter, flirty, saying hooking was my bet he'd bite it hard. The night deepened, tension thick, and I lingered, knowing I'd lit something, stars bright, stakes brighter. Mom slept inside, and I headed in, leaving him with the scope, his eyes still on me, a quiet challenge. I knew I'd hooked him, a sky clear, fire kindled. 2 days after the balcony starlit tease, I was still buzzing from Ron's hand on my back, his low chuckle echoing like a signal I couldn't tune out. Mom was still off on her logistics conference, her last text a distracted bet I'd keep the house orderly, not even close. I found Ron in the garage that afternoon, the air sharp with motor oil and sawdust, where he was hunched over my old bike, tweaking the chain, his faded flannel rolled to his elbows, jeans streaked with grease. I'd roped him into helping with my college eco project, a pitch for urban gardens, and needed his brain for stats, knowing he'd been crunching numbers for green initiatives. He didn't look up, just grunted I'd better not wreck the bike, bet I'd crash it first ride. I grinned, leaned on the workbench, my sneakers brushing the concrete near his, flirty, saying he looked sexy with a wrench, bet he'd fix me up too. He smirked, spun the pedal, and said fixes didn't flirt, bet I'd tangle the chain. I slid closer, my hip grazing the bench, teasing that tangling was my vibe, bet he'd tune it anyway. He glanced up, his hand brushing a rag by my wrist, fingers hovering close, and said tuning was my dodge, bet I'd throw him off track. I bumped his shoulder with mine, flirty, saying throwing was my flair, bet he'd ride it sharp. He smirked, tightened a bolt, his arm nudging mine, muttering flaring was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this repair. I pulled out my notebook, flipping to my project notes, teasing that owing was my hook, bet he'd crunch my numbers with that grin. He took it, his fingers brushing mine, teasing, saying crunching was my bluff, bet I'd botch the math. I grinned, grabbed a pencil, sketching a goofy sun with shades on his page, flirty, saying botching was my art, bet he'd frame it. He laughed, low and warm, leaning closer, his knee brushing my leg, muttering framing was my snare, bet I'd hook him silly. I tapped the sketch, flirty, saying hooking was my rush, bet he'd hang it high. We dove into the project, arguing over soil data, his stats were solid, but I pushed for rooftop gardens, flirty, saying I'd outgrow him, bet I'd plant better. He smirked, said I'd kill the crops, bet I'd wilt in a week. I waved the pencil, teasing I'd show him, bet I'd bloom. Rushing to grab a coffee mug from the bench, I knocked it over, brown splashing his flannel. I gasped, giggling, snatching a rag, dabbing his chest, my fingers lingering, flirty, saying oops, bet I'd owe him a shirt. He caught my wrist, light, teasing, muttering owing was my chaos, bet I'd stain him worse. I leaned in, my shoulder brushing his chest, flirty, saying staining was my thrill, bet he'd wear it anyway. He smirked, took the rag, his hand grazing my arm, muttering wearing was my trap, bet I'd mess him more. I bumped his hip, teasing, saying messing was my win, bet he'd clean it up. The garage hummed, sunlight fading, and I stayed close, saying he was too steady, bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the notebook, muttering flaring was my tangle, bet I'd wreck this space. I stepped back, grabbing a fresh coffee, my knee brushing his thigh, flirty, saying he looked too good greasy, bet he'd spark my project. He smirked, turned the wrench, his arm brushing my shoulder, muttering sparking was my hustle, bet I'd reel him too far. I bumped his chest, flirty, saying reeling was my bet he'd bite it hard. The dusk settled, tension thick, and I knew I'd hooked him, bike fixed, stakes firing. For days after the bike repair flirt, the Miami sun hung low, painting the local park in shades of gold and green as I, Emma, 19, sprawled on a picnic blanket, sipping a soda, the air alive with salt breeze and distant laughter. Mom was still off on her logistics conference. Her last text a sharp bet I'd avoid trouble, not even in the ballpark. I'd been replaying Ron's steady smirks, his quick saves, and they'd sunk deeper than I'd intended. He was out here too, fiddling with a camera on a tripod, his faded jacket slung over a bench, tee loose over khakis, trying to snap a rare heron for his eco-consulting blog. He muttered I'd better not scare it, I bet I'd spook the whole flock. I grinned, tossed Micah aside, flirty, saying he looked hot with a lens, bet he'd shoot me better. He smirked, adjusted the focus, and said shots didn't flirt, bet I'd blur the frame. I stood, sauntering over, my sandals brushing the grass near his tripod, teasing that flirting was my focus, bet he'd snap it sharp. He glanced up, his hand brushing the camera by my hip, fingers hovering close, and said snapping was my sidestep, bet I'd throw his aim off. I leaned in, my elbow grazing his arm, flirty, saying throwing was my flash, bet he'd capture it tight. He smirked, clicked a test shot, his shoulder nudging mine, muttering flashing was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this frame. I grabbed my phone, flirty, challenging him to a photo contest, bet I'd catch that heron first. He laughed, saying I'd miss, bet I'd snap a squirrel instead. I darted toward the pond, the phone up, teasing I'd show him, bet I'd win. He chased, camera swinging, his sneakers pounding the grass, shouting I'd scare it, I bet I'd eat dirt. I spotted the bird, lunged, but my foot caught a root, and I tumbled, crashing into the grass, laughing, my tank top shifting. Ron dove, catching my waist, his hands firm, pulling me up, his chest brushing my back, muttering I was a wreck, bet I'd cost him the shot. My pulse spiked, his grip warm, and I bumped his chest with my elbow, flirty, saying costing was my vibe, bet he'd save the bird anyway. He smirked, steadied me, his hand brushing my arm, teasing that saving was my lure, bet I'd drag him down. I grinned, bumped his hip, flirty, saying dragging was my thrill, bet he'd chase it anyway. The heron flapped away, and I pouted, flirty, saying he'd jinxed it, bet I'd get him back. He smirked, raised his camera, snapping me in the grass, muttering getting was my trap, bet I'd frame him worse. I stood, brushing dirt off, my knee brushing his thigh, flirty, saying he looked too good shooting, bet he'd catch my spark. He smirked, checked the photo, his arm grazing mine, muttering catching was my hustle, bet I'd reel him out. I bumped his elbow, teasing, saying reeling was my win, bet he'd pose for me. He laughed, handed me the camera, flirty, daring me, bet I'd botch the shot. I aimed, clicked, but the strap snagged, yanking the tripod. It tipped, and I gasped, diving to catch it, landing sprawled beside him, giggling, flirty, saying oops, bet I'd owe him big. He smirked, pulled me up, his hand brushing my shoulder, muttering owing was my chaos, bet I'd wreck his gear. I bumped his chest, flirty, saying wrecking was my rush, bet he'd fix it anyway. The park quieted, dusk falling, and I stayed close, saying he was too steady, bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the camera, muttering flaring was my tangle, bet I'd blur this night. I grinned, flirty, saying blurring was my bet he'd bite it hard. The tension hummed, and I knew I'd hooked him, bird gone, stakes soaring. 3 days after the park photo chase, the Miami evening was thick with the scent of rain and spices, the kitchen of our high-rise alive with the clatter of bowls and a crackling radio playing a lo-fi beat. Mom was still off on her logistics conference, her last voicemail a gruff bet I'd keep the mess minimal, not a chance. I'd been turning over Ron's quick grins, his steady hands, and they'd rooted deeper than I'd meant. I leaned on the counter, in a loose tee and shorts, tossing dough for a homemade pizza, flour dusting my hands. Ron came in, sleeves rolled up on his faded button-up, khakis smudged, carrying a bag of groceries, tomatoes, cheese, basil, saying he'd cook, bet I'd burn it black. I grinned, a flirty, flicked flour at him, saying he looked hot with ingredients, bet he'd spice me up too. He smirked, dropped the bag, and said spices didn't flirt, bet I'd ruin the sauce. I slid closer, my hit brushing the counter by his arm, teasing that ruining was my recipe, bet he'd taste it anyway. He glanced over, his hand brushing a tomato by my wrist, fingers lingering, and said tasting was my dodge, bet I'd throw his dish off. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying throwing was my zest, bet he'd cook it sharp. He smirked, chopped a tomato, his elbow grazing mine, muttering zesting was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this pie. I grabbed the dough, kneading it, flirty, teasing that owing was my sauce, bet he'd bake it with that grin. He took a pinch of flour, flicked it at me, his fingers brushing my arm, teasing, saying baking was my bluff, bet I'd crumble it. I laughed, flirty, tossed a handful back, flour dusting his shirt, saying crumbling was my kick, bet he'd eat it anyway. He smirked, lunged, smearing flour on my cheek, muttering eating was my trap, bet I'd hook him dusty. I squealed, flirty, grabbing more, and we broke into a playful flour fight, clouds puffing, the kitchen a haze, my knee brushing his thigh as I dodged. The radio hit a slower tune, and I spun, slipping on a slick of flour, my foot skidding. I gasped, flailing, and Ron caught me, his arms wrapping my waist, pulling me upright, his chest brushing my back, muttering I was a disaster, bet I'd wreck his kitchen. My pulse raced, his grip warm, and I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying wrecking was my flavor, bet he'd savor it. He smirked, steadied me, his hand brushing my arm, teasing that savoring was my snare, bet I'd drag him down. I grinned, bumped his hip, flirty, saying dragging was my thrill, bet he'd stir it up. We cleaned the mess, flour clinging to us, and I grabbed a rag, wiping the counter, flirty, saying he looked too good dusted, bet he'd cook my spark. He smirked, took it, his fingers grazing mine, muttering cooking was my hustle, bet I'd burn him out. I bumped his shoulder, teasing, saying burning was my rush, bet he'd fan it anyway. He leaned in, his arm brushing my side, muttering fanning was my chaos, bet I'd blaze this place. I laughed, flirty, tossed the rag, saying blazing was my win, bet he'd glow with it. The pizza baked, the oven ticking, and I stayed close, saying he was too steady, bet he'd flare if I dared. He smirked, bumped my elbow, his hand brushing mine on the counter, muttering flaring was my tangle, bet I'd mess him up. I leaned in, my knee brushing his thigh, flirty, saying messing was my bet he'd bite it hard. He smirked, checked the oven, his arm grazing my shoulder, and I knew I'd hooked him. Flour settled, steaks sizzling. The day before Mom was due back from her logistics conference, her flu finally fading, I'd been stoking a 2-week spark with Ron, 57, ex-astronomer turned eco-consultant, in our Miami home. Her last text was a gruff bet I'd kept things quiet, wildly off. I was restless, craving a night louder than our balcony talks or kitchen messes, so I convinced Ron for a beach party under the stars, a local bash with bonfires and music. I slipped into a cropped top and denim shorts, my sandals kicking sand as I dragged him to the shore, his loose tee and khakis sharp in the firelight. He parked near the dunes, muttering I'd spark a riot, bet I'd pull him into one. I grinned, flirty, nudging his arm, saying he looked hot by the waves, bet he'd ride my tide. The party roared, bonfires crackling, reggae thumping, bodies swaying in the salt air. I grabbed a beer from a cooler, flirty, handing him one, my fingers brushing his, teasing he'd need it and bet he'd loosen up tonight. He smirked, took a sip, his knee nudging mine as we stood by a fire, muttering loosening was my dodge, bet I'd reel him out. I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying reeling was my spark, bet he'd surf it anyway. He smirked, clinked his can to mine, teasing that surfing was my hustle, bet I'd wipe him out. The music hit a faster beat, and I pulled him to the sandy dance floor, the crowd pulsing, my hips swaying as I spun, flirty, teasing he'd better move, bet he'd match my rhythm. He stepped in, hands hovering near my waist, light but guiding, muttering matching was my chaos, bet I'd spin him dizzy. I laughed, spun closer, my shoulder grazing his chest, saying spinning was my flair, bet he'd catch it quick. His grip settled, loose, his knee brushing mine, teasing that catching was my trap, bet I'd twist him up. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying twisting was my rush, bet he'd hold on tight. A group started a sandcastle contest, and I dared him, flirty, saying I'd build better, bet he'd crumble. He smirked, dropped to the sand, sculpting a tower, muttering crumbling was my vibe, bet I'd bury him. I piled sand, teasing he looked too good digging, bet I'd win. My castle collapsed, and I shoved his, laughing, flirty, as it fell. He lunged, grabbing my wrist, pulling me down, and we tumbled into the sand, my hands on his arms, giggling, saying he'd cheated, bet I'd owe him. He smirked, his hand brushing my shoulder, muttering owing was my mess, bet I'd cost him more. At a vendor stall, he bought a beaded bracelet, flirty, slipping it on my wrist, his fingers lingering, teasing it suited me, bet I'd lose it. I grinned, hooked one on his, flirty, saying he'd were my spark, bet he'd shine. Thunder rumbled, clouds rolling in, and I swayed, daring him to dance one more, bet he'd bolt. He pulled me close, his arm brushing my back, muttering bolting was my snare, bet I'd blaze him out. The crowd scattered as rain loomed, cutting the party short. I sighed, heart racing, wanting more, his pull was electric, and I was hooked. I bumped his chest, flirty, saying he was too steady, bet he'd flare if I pushed. He smirked, his hand brushing my wrist, muttering flaring was my tangle, bet I'd burn this night. The storm growled, and we ran for the car, my shoulder grazing his arm, flirty, saying storms were my win, bet he'd chase them. He smirked, muttering chasing was my hustle, bet I'd reel him too far. I grinned, flirty, knowing I'd snagged him, sand stuck, stakes soaring. The morning after the beach party, Mom's return from her logistics conference was hours away. Her last text a curt bet I'd kept the house calm, oblivious to the wildfire I'd sparked with Ron, 57, ex-astronomer turned eco-consultant, over 2 weeks in our Miami home. The sky churned gray, a storm rolling in, and I was restless, the memory of Ron's hands on my hips by the bonfire fueling a restless itch. I found him in the garage, where we'd sought shelter from the rain, the air thick with motor oil and damp concrete. He was tinkering with an old radio to catch weather updates, his faded tee streaked with grease, khakis loose, hair mussed from the wind. I leaned on the workbench, in a loose hoodie and shorts, flirty, saying he looked hot fixing static, bet he'd tune my signal too. He smirked, twisted a dial, and said signals didn't flirt, bet I'd jam the frequency. I slid closer, my hip grazing the bench, teasing that jamming was my vibe, bet he'd dial it anyway. He glanced up, his hand brushing a wrench by my wrist, fingers hovering, muttering dialing was my dodge, bet I'd throw him off air. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying throwing was my pulse, bet he'd catch it sharp. He smirked, adjusted the antenna, his arm nudging mine, muttering pulsing was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this broadcast. I grabbed a rag, wiping a smudge off the radio, flirty, teasing that Owen was my hook, bet he'd play it with that grin. He took it, his fingers brushing mine, teasing, saying playing was my bluff, bet I'd scramble him out. I bumped his elbow, flirty, saying scrambling was my kick, bet he'd bite it anyway. The radio crackled, a storm warning buzzing, and I leaned in, my knee brushing his leg, teasing he was too steady, bet he'd flare in this gale. He smirked, turned the volume up, his hand brushing my arm, muttering flaring was my tangle, bet I'd wreck this shelter. The rain hammered the roof, and I pushed, flirty, saying he looked too good stormbound, bet he'd chase my spark. He stood, closing the distance, his chest an inch from mine, muttering chasing was my hustle, bet I'd reel him too far. I grinned, bold, stepping closer, my shoulder grazing his, flirty, saying reeling was my rush, bet he'd dive in. His hand brushed my waist, light, warm, pulling me nearer, his breath sharp, teasing diving was my trap, bet I'd hook him deep. My pulse raced, and I leaned in, my lips hovering near his, flirty, whispering hooking was my win, bet he'd bite it hard. Lightning cracked, and I froze, the thrill souring, something snapped inside, a wave of doubt crashing over me. This was wrong, too far, and I pulled back, my hands pushing his chest, muttering I can't, bet this was a mistake. He stepped away, hands dropping, stunned, saying mistakes were my call, bet I'd run now. I shook my head, heart pounding, saying running was right, bet he'd see why. I bolted inside, the storm raging, knowing I'd stopped it cold. Mom rolled in that evening, and a nosy neighbor had already spilled, seen us laughing too close at the market. She confronted me, voice sharp, saying she'd heard enough, bet I'd broken her trust. I admitted the flirting, saying I'd stopped, bet she'd understand. She didn't, packing my bag, saying I'd stay with a friend, bet I'd learn. I left, the rain still falling, Ron's silhouette in the garage fading, knowing I'd lit it, bet it burned me most.